Greetings all. Today, we crusade.
The four principal Crusader states were very different from the European monarchies, loosely configured, short-lived, combative lordships. The largest was Edessa, founded in 1098. By 1150, it had mostly been subsumed into the Seljuk Empire. Antioch, although a patriarch of the Roman Church, it had a tiny European Christian population. It ceased to exist in 1268, when its lands became part of the vast new empire of the Mongols. We have the county of Tripoli, founded in 1109, which linked the northern states of Edessa and Antioch with the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Tripoli's strategic commercial position exposed it to constant raids and threats of invasion.
Crusader States had a thin veneer of European influence on top of a deep, complex culture that withstood superficial change. These Europeans, at least those who chose to stay, would become intertwined with local populations, intermarrying and adopting their fashions, food, and outlook. In other words, they went native. But they would have more in common with their locals than their European counterparts.
Fear of raids and invasions led the rulers of Tripoli to entrust most of the frontier to one of the military orders, which were dedicated to perpetual pursuit of the crusading effort, the Knights Hospitalier. They were charged with the care of pilgrims in the Hospital of St. John at Jerusalem, which was founded in 1023. They became militarized after 1099. They had controlled the islands of Rhodes and Malta and many strategic fortifications in the eastern Mediterranean.
To give you an idea, here are the Crusader States. This map shows the fragile colonies, known as the Crusader States, really at their greatest extent as of 1100. So, what geographical, political, and military factors would make these states vulnerable? Let's move on to something more specific, namely the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the Conquest of Saladin.
The kingship in Jerusalem was dependent on aid from other Crusader states and Europeans. The defense of the kingdom therefore came to rest on another of the new crusading orders, the Knights Templar, founded during the reign of King Baldwin II of Jerusalem, who reigned between 1118 and 1131. The Templars were based on the captured Al-Aqsa Mosque. The Kingdom of Jerusalem persisted, in theory, until 1291. It ceased to have any purchase on Jerusalem itself after 1187, when a Kurdish chieftain, Salah ad-Din, who lived approximately 1138 to 1193, who had become the Sunni Sultan of both Egypt and Syria, who had rallied Muslims' opposition to the occupying Crusader forces and succeeded in recapturing the Holy City.
The Kingdom of Jerusalem, the fourth and most symbolically important of the Crusader states, was really just a network of cities and fortresses that really constantly would change hands. The cosmopolitan population reflected the number of people who claimed the Holy Land for their own, i.e., Muslims, both Sunni and Shia, Orthodox Christians, Greek and Syrian, alongside other smaller communities, Jews, Sumerians, and the tiny European population.
Saladin's conquest of Jerusalem became the target of a renewed crusading effort, the Third Crusade, from 1189 to 1192. This spurred three kings to take the cross: England's Richard the Lionheart, France's Philip Augustus, and the Holy Roman Empire's Frederick Barbarossa. Now, Frederick was killed. Philip left early, and Richard was captured on the way home. Victorious Saladin became celebrated by Muslims and Crusaders, who considered him a paragon of chivalry.
The city of Acre then became the new capital of the Christian kingdom until its fall in 1291, and that would mark the end of pretty much any viable European presence in the region.
In the 1160s, rulers of Denmark and the German Duchy of Saxony began to colonize the Baltic coast and the lands between the Elbe and Oder rivers. The efforts were represented as a missionary movement, but were an attempt to control trade in that region.
The English were launching crusades against the Irish and the Welsh, who, at this point, were Christian. They would argue that the Celts needed the civilizing influence of the superior English overlords. Here we have the Crac des Chevaliers, the necessity of securing hard won territory in the Holy Land led to the construction of fortresses such as this one, built by the Knights Hospitaller in the early 12th century, when crusading movements were also being launched in Europe itself. Very similar castles, as we shall see, were built to subjugate peoples deemed rebellious or heretical, regardless whether or not they were at home or abroad. But speaking of crusading orders, let's transition to the Teutonic Knights.
Movement was not undertaken peacefully. It was spearheaded by members of the military crusading order of the Teutonic Knights. In 1202, they carved out a bishopric around Riga in Latvia, where they violently converted the indigenous inhabitants. The Knights also clashed with the peoples of Poland and Rus.
Oh, yes. And now the crusading orders will turn on Constantinople. We have the Fourth Crusade, 1202 to 04, which was envisioned by Pope Innocent III and would ultimately end in the destruction of Constantinople. The object of his expedition was Egypt, and this meant launching an attack by sea. The natural departure point was Venice, of course, which had, of course, benefited greatly from the Crusades. The relations with Constantinople will worsen as the Crusades would damage its prosperity. In 1182, anti crusading sentiment would lead enraged citizens in Constantinople to massacre or banish enclaves of Italian merchants, including Venetians.
Indeed, Venetians resented the Byzantines and were now overrun by an army of impoverished crusaders who could not afford the passage to Cairo. Instead of sailing to Egypt, the expedition was diverted to Zara on the Adriatic, a former Venetian port under the protection of Hungary. The city was attacked and taken. The Crusaders then moved to Constantinople. After a terrible siege, the city was savagely sacked in 1204. Venetians colonized the city itself, controlling trade and taking Crete. Only in 1261 was Byzantine rule reestablished in the capital, but the empire had shrunk to a fraction of its former size.
Alarmed by the Fourth Crusade, Innocent III hoped that it would ultimately unite the two churches. Elected to the papal dignity at the age of 37, his goal was to unify all of Christendom and the wider world under papal dominion. He saw the Pope's role as regulatory and disciplinary. When rulers sinned, they should be reprimanded or excommunicated by the Pope, who could call into question the legitimacy of their rule. He was also more insistent than his predecessors on the obligation of every Christian to obey the Pope as Jesus Christ's representative on earth. And who boy would this be an unpopular opinion?
Innocent III was the first pope to codify the benefits, or indulgences, crusaders would receive, although previous popes had also made use of them. These benefits included pardons for sins, debt forgiveness, property protection, and possibly eternal salvation for particularly valorous deeds. The fear of damnation was widespread in the medieval Christian world, and the Catholic Church had control over the afterlives of their followers, at least in their minds. His goals were ultimately to take Jerusalem, which had been lost to Saladin in 1187, and liberate Muslim Egypt. After the failure of the Fourth Crusade, Innocent III would push for the Fourth Lateran Council. During the pontificate of Innocent III, 1198 to 1216, Attempts in the reform of the church and its freedom from subservience to the empire, as well as the primacy of the Bishop of Rome, and in the summoning of ecclesiastical businesses to the Roman Curia. Ultimately, these attempts would fail due to his premature death in 1216. But the message was clear. The church should not be subservient to the state.
The results of Innocent III's crusade were less than he had hoped. It made the papacy financially and politically independent by consolidating papal territories in central Italy. It proclaimed his power as kingmaker and as kingbreaker by brokering the selection of the Holy Roman Emperor. It also disciplined both Philip Augustus of France for, of course, marital misconduct. John of England was also compelled to grant England itself to the papacy as a fief after he had already given it to France. He would also claim lordship over Aragon, Sicily, and Hungary.
The crowning achievement of Innocent's pontificate was the ratification of his agenda at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. This council defined central dogmas of the Church. It acknowledged papal supremacy. All Christians had to acknowledge the Pope's ultimate power, and those unwilling to do so were heretics and could be prosecuted and punished.
So he also has a response to urbanization, establishing free primary schools in all major cities. He required bishops to recruit effective preachers. He would also outlaw all kinds of misbehavior within the clergy. He mandated that infidels be visibly distinguished from Christians by wearing a distinctive clothing, i.e., the Jewish badge. He also sought to increase the distance between Christians and their Muslims and Jewish neighbors by discouraging social relationships, economic exchanges, intermarriage. Wait, this hardly sounds positive.
Innocent's reign achieved the height of papal power, but it also sowed the seeds of discord. The papal states bordered on the Kingdom of Sicily. Innocent's successors soon came into conflict with the Emperor Frederick II. Instead of excommunicating him, the papacy called a crusade against him.
Innocent had paved the way for this policy by declaring a crusade against heretics, any group or individual who did not fall in line with the papacy's policies. The more the church claimed the right to control every aspect of belief and practice, the more it made itself vulnerable to those who challenged its enforcement. In the late 12th and 13th centuries, the church began to lose its capacity to respond inclusively to these new challenges, preferring to crack down on heretics which undermined its power. Innocent III crushed the Cathars, as an example. The church only interfered with the Waldensians' ministry when they began to preach without authorization. The Waldensians were condemned as heretics in response, and they articulated a more radical opposition to the established hierarchy.
Now, crusades were not only targeting the Byzantines and the Muslims, but local European peoples as well. For example, the Albigensian Crusade. This was launched in 1209. The crusade was directed against a heretical sect called the Cathars. It was justified by the colonization of southern France by land-hungry knights from northern France. It ended in 1255. It created lasting tensions within the area, which would reappear during the Hundred Years' War and the Reformation.
Look at this Albigensian massacre from the Chronicle of St. Denis. Aren't those Albigensians so threatening? Aren't they scary? Look at all their weapons. Oh, no, wait, sorry, the Albigensians are the guys on the right. But this image here is from a 14th century manuscript in London, currently held in the British Library. Let's rewind for a second and have a look at the Waldensians proper before we conclude today's video.
Now, from the teachings of a merchant named Peter Waldo, or Valdez, the lay people who wished to imitate the life of Christ to the fullest. They were active in the vernacular translation and study of the Gospels. and dedicated to lives of poverty and preaching.
Waldensian teachings came into conflict with the Catholic Church, and by 1215 the Waldensians were declared heretical. Not because they preached apostolic poverty, which, of course, the Franciscans also preached, because they were not willing to recognize the prerogatives of local bishops over the content of their own preaching. Nor did they recognize the standards about who was fit to preach. In other words, they wanted to do everything the Catholic Church thought was good, just without the Catholic Church's rubber stamp of approval. They wanted autonomy. But that brings an end to today, for next time we delve into the results of all this crusading and religious fervor, as we cannot cover that here. Alright, y'all. Take it easy.